this is Ian Sun, and this video is for FIT's MGT 5151 Data System Management course, and this is the final project video presentation for the gamer user study I did from the Steam user data and the survey data published by Vol Corporation. And the gaming industry has been shifting rapidly for the past 20-30 years because the technology has changed drastically. From the first game I ever really enjoyed back in the 1980s was the Tetris, and to nowadays we can see the Call of Duties and new Battlefields, which is a lot more photorealistic and way more complex than what it was back in the 1980s. And the issue between those is the game is getting more complex and more difficult to develop, and you can no longer have, you can still have one person to build the entire game, but mostly these days we have large game studios such as Activision, Blizzard, Bungie. They are at least have 100-200 people working on one game. And the project management strategy has evolved dramatically as well. I think we've gone back into the sashimi models, to the recent agile model, into the spring such as Scrum. And since the traditional waterfall project management will not fit the game industry very well, since it involves a lot of testing and redoing what we already have done. In every single sprint, we want to have a working proper demo each time. The way the waterfall project manager method involved a lot of planning ahead of time, and they push all the testing and implementation at the end of the project cycle, which wouldn't work for a game because, most of the game developers do not know what the game looks like at the beginning of the time. A lot of the times it's a try and error process, and if at the end of the project period you realize your game is not working or it's not fun at all, we had to redo the whole thing, which is such a waste of time and money and would totally not work. So let's jump into the data study. The attribute we're using in this data set will be age, gender, ethnicity, and daily time spent playing games, and the game devices, and such as platforms as well, and preferred genre, like RPG, first-person shooters, puzzles, and things like that. And we also are going to take the online and offline game mode into considerations because it has been a trend for the past 10 years. Every single game has to have an online mode. For my opinion, it's totally unnecessary, but that's what the game studio are doing. There are other attributes, but I'll talk about more in the actual data report. And before we go into further more detail, I like to talk about the platforms in the attribute section. For you that don't really know about gaming industry as much, the industry are divided in terms of platforms are PC, consoles, and mobile gaming. And PC is its own thing. It has many developers, and also I consider Linux in part of PC as well because, it's not as usual because PC is basically dominated by Microsoft, but there are other users since most of game publishers don't build their game for Linux. Usually it's driven to Linux later on, that's why we have bit diversity issues. But as in terms of game itself, not the machine running it, there's thousands of developers every day coming out, so they're their own things. But now we're going to consoles. There's two major categories. One's home consoles that you hook up to a TV and you play at home. That's why home console. Then you got the handheld console such as 3DS, PSP. Then you can bring it onto subways, like buses, transportations, basically something you can pull out your backpack and play it as you go. And then we got the mobile gaming, which is has been rising up for the last 10 years since smartphone has been a pretty big thing. And their specs are getting higher and higher. They start being able to catch up with the console handheld. It was a thing back in 2000, but most of the phone back then, Nokia and Motorola, they cannot run certain games as smooth as the other handheld devices such as Game Boy, PSP. It's not comparable. But these days, mobile actually start having a little bit edge. But if we look at the directly competitor as a platform, PC and home console are actually in the same category, and handheld console and mobile gaming are in the same marketing consumer base at least. So we can see there's a bit of overlapping going on. And if we were going into the major players that in the gaming industry, such as in terms of platform, obviously, and we got Sony and then Microsoft for the home console. Sony has the PS3 and the PS4, and Microsoft has Xbox 360 and Xbox One. And well, as current generation, what we call it, I think it's PS4 and Xbox One. PS3 and Xbox 360 is still in the market, but they start phasing out. It has been 4 or 5 years. And if we look at the section for, yes, Sony has its own handheld console, such as PSP, PS Vita, and Microsoft does not have its own handheld console. So in that category, right, so another company we're going to mention is Nintendo. Nintendo has Wii U as its home console, but last year they released a new Switch, which is a home console, but you can also take it apart, use it as a handheld console, which is unique in its own way, but it hasn't been tested for very long, and there's a lot of issues come with it. People have been complaining, but maybe the next generation will be better. And now we look at the mobile gaming part, this iOS, Apple, obviously, and then you get Android. Android, which is basically the platform, because you can use Android on basically any type of smartphones these days. Like Samsung, LG, doesn't matter. But the Google Play Store is the major supplier for the Android system, and iOS obviously is the Apple Store. Okay. Now let's look at the actual data in the survey. So most of people would think video game is more like a guy thing, and you don't see that many female players, at least on the major gaming, nearly as much. And if you go into like EA Sports, I would like to say 99% of the pro players are male, which is very dominant. But if we look at the gamer distribution in the US by gender in 2016, you can see actually about 54% players are male and 46% players are female. But again, here it's about the definition of gamers. If a person that has a phone and he has one game on it, he probably would consider as a gamer. How strictly the definition of gamer is will definitely change how this data will be represented. But if we look at this particular data, the average daily game time in US by genders, we can see a lot more difference between male and female. Overall, males spend a lot more time than female in terms of playing games. But if we look at, right, this particular data is separated by weekdays and weekends. If you look into the weekends and holidays, men's and women's are not that much of a difference. It's like 6 minutes of difference every day. But the particularly interesting case in this one is the big gap for women between weekdays and weekends. So this pretty much means women rather play their game during the weekends, or they're just have other things to do during the weekdays, where they have other leisure way to spend their time. But men overall play about the same amount of the game during weekdays or weekends. And this is the game distribution in the US by ethnicity, but this particular data is diluted in certain ways because the way how US divide by ethnicity is major, like Caucasian is very dominant in US. So if we want to look at how different ethnicity play games, we have to look into the next data, which is the average daily game time by ethnicity. This is not diluted by the populations. It's only focusing on how many time each ethnicity group spend on playing games. And overall, we can see the whites have basically the same shape as the male in the average daily game span in US. In terms of how dominant white Caucasian are in the US populations, we can see how this will be similar. And if we look at in the African American and Asians group, there are a large gap between weekdays and weekends. There's many possibilities for this. Either they're a lot more busier during the weekdays, where they rather spend more time playing games during the weekends or doing something else, such as go camping, boating, as Caucasian would normally do, and that could be the difference. And now let's look at the global leading reason to play games, and there's a two graph for male and females. So, and this particular data is global, not just US. And this entire data set tells us the different stories, and as why we want to play a game. And we play games because they're fun, but there are certain attributes that drive women and men differently into games. And if we look at the male data, the number one is competitions, which is a very male testosterone thing to do, but that is true. That's how drive men to do certain thing is competition. They want to be better than others, and they want to feel they're better than others. Because as the game content goes out, the only driving force is the competition between people. Then they would keep driving people coming back to the games. But if we look at the female graph, number one is completions, well, such as trophies, achievements, stuff like that. And if we look at competition over here, which is ranked very late with only 5.1%, this shows women does not care about competition nearly as much as male. But as recent years, more and more games start driving into online game mode. Those PvP inside the PvE environment game are driving women away from such a game, because you cannot play this game without going online, which is involving competition, which can be a turn-off to a lot of female players. And now we look at the best game platform, well, favorite game platform, not necessarily as the number of a player in some of these platforms. Is number one is PlayStation, then it goes to Windows, such as PC gaming, then you go to Xbox, and Android, iOS, then Mac. Well, this is, like I said, was favorite game platform, not as how many people are playing it, because in terms of qualities, you cannot compare home console to a cell phone. That is what it is. And now let's look at the online and offline gamers in the United States by platforms. And as I mentioned before, the three major home console companies are Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo. These are the current generation console for each company. Well, let's not count Switches, that wasn't a thing back in 2015 yet. And we can see that for Xbox, there are a lot more players would like to play their games online than playing the game offline, which is completely opposite for the other two companies. This is caused by how the online game platform built for each console. For Microsoft, it is free, and that's why more people plays it. I like to clarify it's not completely free. They do have their own membership, but most of the game you can go online and play without spending money. In terms of Sony's, they have a monthly subscription as the what we call the PS Plus. You have to buy a membership to play certain online game. That's why there's a giant about 19% gap between online play and offline play. But if you look at Nintendo, it is still free, but their server support is just horrible, and it's constant lag, game freezes, stuff like that. But they're doing something different for Switches. Actually, this incoming September, so this will likely shift towards the way it looks like for Xbox. And this is the online gaming subscription description in US by platform. Like I said before, the consoles has its own subscription fee, such as PlayStation Plus. Well, you cannot play an online game without subscription. That's why it's a lot higher. And now you look at Xbox Live Gold, which gave Xbox One player a lot more access to online games. They also get free games online, so dedicated gamers usually have it either way. And certain games, you have to have it to play the online mode as well. And the others for the online gameplay modes are usually in PC, such as what would Final Fantasy 14 or Guild of War, things like that. And we can see a lot of people don't particularly like online games because they're expensive. A lot of subscription, about $30 a month, but they do have a lot more update compared to single player games. And let's combine the two research we have so far together. One is in between online and offline. The other one is by genders. And we can see that in this particular graph, 41% of female players said no about playing multiplayer games in US, and only 21% of male players said so. This are completely reflected by the previous study in the female leading reasons and the male leading reasons to play games. That is the competitions. The competition is reflected in multiplayer games. Maybe certain games has pure PvE and cooperation mode, but about 99% of the game that has online mode, there's a PvP into it, which are driving the female players away. That's what we can see over here. Largely 41% of the players do not particularly want to play the online mode. And as a conclusions, and this has been a really big trend that every single game studio try to add online mode for their game, which is completely unnecessary in my opinion. Of course, for Call of Duty first-person shooter games, you have to have a PvP mode. It just does not make sense if it doesn't. But for such as RPG and Dark Souls 3, things like that, and they're forcing into the PvP element into the game, which is not particularly necessary. It spends a lot of resources and they have to balance their game separately in terms of PvP and PvE, and people don't particularly enjoy it. As we can see, a lot of people just don't want to play their game online. But again, if you don't have the option to play it online, a lot of people will complain as well. So there is a very delicate balance in there. But in turns, and I believe some of the game producer has to take a look into your game and think about it if the online mode is necessary. And you cannot just focus on the male audience that they say, we want competition, we want to fight this, and we're talking out loud. But we have to also consider the female audience that do not want to play the game online. At least give them an option to engage in such activity without doing so. Okay, this has been my report for this January study, and if you want to see other analysis, it is in my final report, which can drive other story towards platform and how they buy their games, and how the marketing strategy should be for each, as an aspect from the game developer or the console builder or the marketing people. And this is it. And thank you very much. This is Ian Son. Nice talking to you.